consulted for notable Canadian companies, helping diagnose problems and preferring appropriate solutions for growth and profitability. He currently lives and works in Canada, and today at the platform, he is speaking on a topic, developing sustainable economic growth. Please join me as we welcome Mr. Roman Oseghale.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm going to be talking about a very sensitive issue, and I would implore everyone to please listen attentively because we're going to be walking and I'll be explaining things along timelines. But before I start, I want to really thank Pastor Pojo Imade for giving me the opportunity and telling me to come down to come give this talk. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, developing a sustainable economic growth ensures both economic and political stability in any country. It is the gateway to creating wealth and the basis of confidence in any economy, and what prevents the devastating and inefficient impact of corporate premature failure and death. Okay. So what do? We carry out business analysis of organizations by using survey analysis and business intelligence tools and models. We are able to trace back the cause of every challenge using both qualitative and quantitative data. We match this data with timelines to know where an organization either took the wrong decision, followed the wrong turn, or where market forces changed demand and which now affects growth and profitability. And at the same time, comparing this data to both market and industry standards. In the case of Nigeria, what we did was to take Nigeria back 57 years, analyzing data from 1960 to present day, and comparing this data to those of 80 other countries from 6 continents. There was a time Nigeria had a sustainable economic progress. So what were we doing right? And at what point did we take the wrong turn? Matching this data with those of other countries revealed what we did right and how Nigeria was ahead of some of these countries in per capita income when we did these things. Data also shows that as soon as we stopped, our per capita income started dropping. And the amazing thing is that as soon as these other countries started doing what we were doing in the past, their per capita income started increasing, surpassing that of Nigeria, and putting their economy on the path of sustainable growth. So, to develop a sustainable economic growth, we must look at the factors that drive generic or organic growth in an economy and the agencies and institutions that help sustain such growth. Now, these agencies and institutions are service providers. If they do not exist or their services do not meet the standard required by the country, people will seek for them elsewhere. And as they seek for them outside the country, they take forex with them, putting a strain on the economy. These factors include innovation, manufacturing, and productivity. These are the factors that create generic growth in an economy. While the agencies and institutions that help retain this growth are education, healthcare, aviation, security, tourism, and marine services. So what are the roles of this institution? Private sector and foreign investors need certainty. For growth to happen, government must ensure functioning courts, institutions that are well and functioning, and must protect property rights. The current fight to reduce corruption is therefore key. So, in 1945, the United Nations was formed or constituted. And 2 principal organs of the United Nations were also formed in 1945 and 1948, namely UNESCO and the World Health Organization. And economists had sat down and said, look, for you to be able to achieve sustainable growth in any economy, a developing country must put in 26% of their budget into education. That is investing in education, or 5% of your GDP. And you must be able to invest 15% of your budget in health. So, why education and health? Education ensures that a child moves out of poverty. The first thing that happens is when you educate a child, right, they move to a higher level. And then their productivity increases. Innovation comes in. Health ensures that a child utilizes his or her maximum capacity. And as the maximum capacity is utilized, a country is able to benefit economically from capacity utilization. There's no need to sending a child to Harvard, paying $500,000, right? While that child will be in and out of hospital like 150 days in a year. So, what the research shows is that there is a direct correlation between education expenditure and per capita income. What I've done in this research is I have broken this thing down to the barest minimal, so that even if you are not an economist or you do not understand economic terms, you will be able to understand what I'm going to be explaining. And as per capita income increases, right, GDP ultimately increases. This is the model of the Western world. They concentrate on individuals, educate an individual, and give them the necessary skills. And as the individuals make a better per capita income, it ultimately increases the GDP. So let us look at beyond GDP and mineral resources. Our economy is a mineral resource economy, right? Now, let us look at Africa. God, in his infinite mercy, blessed Africa so much. 1/3. We have six continents, right? And Africa is the richest by mineral resources. 1/3, that is 33.3% of all Earth's mineral resources, is buried in Africa. 2/3, 66% of all mined diamonds comes from Africa. 10%, that is 1/10 of all global oil reserve lies in Africa. 75% of all cocoa products, or cocoa beans rather, come from Africa. And Africa is home to some of the rarest mineral resources. But yet, Africa is the poorest in per capita income. So why? We're the richest in mineral resources, but the poorest in per capita income. We're going to find out why. Now, but it will also interest you that the cocoa industry, right, is worth $100 billion worldwide. But Africa produces 75% of the cocoa beans. And Africa's share is just 2 billion, 2%. 2%. The Netherlands, that does not grow cocoa, processes 13% of all cocoa beans worldwide. Europe and Russia, that do not grow cocoa, processes 38% of all cocoa beans worldwide. Cocoa has tens of products. While we export cocoa beans, these tens of products are brought back to Africa to be sold. So, unlike in the past, the knowledge economy has always been important. But it is the main drivers of the economic growth of the 21st century. Without the best of education, a country is heading nowhere in terms of sustainable economic growth. Knowledge-based economy is therefore key. Education is an economic model for growth and sustainability. We have to move to a knowledge-based economy. It is the main driver and brains behind innovation. It is the brains behind manufacturing and the brains behind the management of productivity. We cannot continue to build our future on mineral resources. It is not the true wealth of a nation. All the progressive countries are operating a knowledge-based economy. Research shows that there is no country that has ever grown without massive investment in human capital development. So, what is human capital development? Let us take the definition. It says it is the collective skills, knowledge, or other intangible assets of individuals that can be used to create economic value for the individual, their employers, or their community. Community here could be seen as a country. Education is an investment in human capital that pays off in terms of what? Higher productivity. But this is the interesting thing. Now, low-income countries account for 37% of world population, 11% of world GDP, but we account for less than 1% of all US registered patents taken out by investors in year 2000. The top 20 countries in patenting, all high-income countries, account for 98% of all patents. Now you see why we export cocoa beans, right? And they bring in tens of products back that are patented, we cannot copy or we cannot duplicate, but we end up buying. They are also the largest investors in what? In education. So we are going to see where the problem is. What we basically do as a company is this. If you have issues, right, we come to you, we look at your processes, we look at the deficiencies, we look at the gaps. We are able to identify these factors, right, by working backwards. We look at your finances, cost control, operations, sales and marketing. And by the time we walk backwards some years into your operations, we are able to detect what the problem is and where you took the wrong turn. So in the case of Nigeria, what I simply did was to take Nigeria back 57 years, right from 1960. In the 60s, it was good, right? In the 70s, it was good. So what were we doing at those periods? And where did we go wrong? So if you look at the net or adjusted net savings of a country, right? Net national savings plus education expenditure, is equals to net national savings plus education expenditure depletion minus damage from carbon dioxide emission minus damage from particulate emission. What does it tell us? Every mineral resources you have, right, is on the minus. For instance, if you have 500 million barrels of crude buried underground, right, by the time you start extracting it, next year you cannot sell that oil well for the same price. But the difference in education is this. Whatever you put in a child, whatever you put in an individual, right, that investment increases the value of that person. And that person's worth is increased. This is the value that the Western world, Europe, North America, right, and the Asian countries have now adopted. But the interesting thing that you will see through data is why our economy was progressing in the 60s and 70s, what we were doing. Now, we conducted the research using data from 80 countries, countries from 6 continents, narrowed down to about 3 countries per continent. All 80 countries proved our hypothesis correct. Asia and Africa were serious case study for Nigeria. Why? Because some of the countries that have overtaken us today, we were ahead of them in the 60s and 70s. And then when we matched this data, everything became clear what we were doing wrong. Nigeria was ahead in per capita income compared to some Asian and African countries in the early 80s. And these countries are ahead of us today. So, this is our GDP. As I said, I'm taking the country back 57 years to 1960. In 1960, our GDP was 4.2 billion. By 1970, it had increased to 12.6 billion. And by 1981, it had increased to 61.1 billion. By 2014, it had increased to 569 billion. Now, the next slide shows our education expenditure. In 1970, right, we had an education expenditure of $185.7 million with a population